June 4th, 1943, Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. A German officer named Unifizia Vera Burkhardt sat quietly, writing in a secret diary. If his superiors had found it, he could have faced severe punishment. "The Americans must be lying," he wrote. "No country could live like this while fighting a war on two fronts." Moments earlier, he had looked out the train window and seen something that completely challenged what Nazi propaganda had told him for years. Every house, shop, and street glowed with electric light. Even late at night, across the wide Texas plains, electricity seemed endless. Back home in Germany, cities had gone dark since 1940 because of blackout orders. Only a small number of farms even had electricity. Yet in America, a place the Nazis had described as weak and broken, power flowed freely everywhere. That night, 1,850 captured soldiers from Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped off a train in Mahia. They weren't packed into freight cars, but traveled in comfortable passenger coaches with dining areas and sleeping sections. The entire town came out to see them arrive. What no one realized at the time was that this moment would begin a major shift in how these German soldiers saw the world, a slow breakdown of Nazi beliefs, brought on not by speeches or threats, but by witnessing America's incredible industrial strength. The beginning of that collapse had come a few weeks earlier, on May 13, 1943, when General Jürgen von Arnim, who had replaced Rommel, surrendered in Tunisia. Between 250,000 and 275,000 German and Italian troops laid down their weapons over several days. These were battle-hardened soldiers, men who had pushed British forces back to Egypt and earned respect from General Montgomery himself. Now, they were prisoners of war. Among them was Feldwebel Friedrich Radke, an Iron Cross recipient and veteran of both the France and North Africa campaigns. Decades later, his recovered diary would offer historians one of the clearest records of how captivity in America changed the mindset of German soldiers. Radke's journey began at the port of Oran in Algeria, where he and about 30,000 others waited in temporary holding camps to be sent to the United States. Even before they boarded ships, many of their assumptions started to crumble. The U.S. Army managed thousands of prisoners every day with remarkable efficiency. They were photographed, given ID cards, vaccinated, and informed of their rights under the Geneva Convention, all explained in fluent German by officers specially trained for this task. But the biggest surprise came with the food. Oberreiter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote to his mother, "While we waited for the ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in months. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. At first, we thought it was just for show, but it turned out to be their regular rations." The ships that carried them to America were themselves symbols of U.S. power. One Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built in just over 4 days at a shipyard in California, a number that would have sounded impossible to any German engineer. At the height of production, 3 of these ships were completed every single day. After delivering supplies to Europe, many returned carrying up to 30,000 prisoners of war per month by the summer of 1943. During the 2-week Atlantic voyage that July, the prisoners saw more proof of the vast difference between the two nations. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, from the 90th Light Division, later wrote that the ship's crew threw away more leftover food each day than his entire company had received in a week during their final months in Africa. This was only the beginning. But for many of these men, the journey across the ocean would mark the first time they realized that the world they had been taught to believe in was built on lies. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann couldn't believe what he saw on the ship. American sailors tossed away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, and even gallons of milk that had simply been left out too long. They did it casually, he later wrote, not to mock us, but because it meant nothing to them. Their supplies seemed endless. The ships themselves felt like lessons in American power. The prisoners learned that their vessel was just one of 2,710 Liberty ships built during the war. Each required about 250,000 individual parts, made in factories spread across 32 different U.S. states. Some guards, proud and talkative, explained that the engines came from 3 separate plants, each producing huge 900-horsepower cylinders, later assembled in ports that hadn't even existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, from an old Prussian military family, recalled a moment that changed his view completely. As their ship neared the American coast, he watched a radar antenna spin above the bridge. That technology, he thought, belonged only to Germany and maybe the British. Yet here it was, standard equipment on a U.S. cargo ship. It was then, he later wrote, that I realized Germany had already lost the war. By August 2nd, 1943, the convoy reached Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. What the prisoners saw there erased the last of their illusions about America being weak or unorganized. The base stretched across more than 4,000 acres, with miles of docks and cranes unloading dozens of ships at once. In one day, Norfolk moved more cargo than the port of Hamburg could handle in a week. Gerhard Johann Weber, who had worked in a Ruhr factory before the war, counted 47 cargo ships in operation that day. In his diary, he noted how each American crane lifted heavy loads with ease, work that in Germany still required teams of men and horses. Everything ran on electricity, clean and steady, without the thick coal smoke that filled German cities. As they were lined up to board trains for their next destination, the men noticed parking lots filled with hundreds of cars belonging to dock workers. In Germany, only the wealthy or party officials could own a car. The people's car, the Volkswagen, had been promised since 1934, but almost none were ever delivered. Here, even laborers drove their own vehicles to work. Then came the greatest shock, the trains themselves. They weren't cramped boxcars or troop wagons, but full passenger trains. The Pullman coaches had padded seats that turned into beds, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, even observation cars with wide windows. We boarded like tourists, not prisoners, wrote Friedrich Radke. One American guard apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working well. The Germans were stunned. They had believed such comfort existed only for Hitler's personal train. The 3-day train ride from Virginia to prison camps in Texas and Oklahoma would destroy more Nazi beliefs than any Allied speech or battlefield defeat ever could. As the trains moved through the American countryside, the soldiers pressed their faces to the glass, speechless. Every small town shone brightly at night. Streets, shops, and homes glowed with electric light. In Germany, small towns were lucky to have one working street lamp. Here, even the smallest communities were lit up like cities. Factories ran all night. Parking lots were full, and neon signs flickered across rooftops. Oberreiter Hans Müller, whose father had been a loyal Nazi Party official in Hamburg, later admitted in a letter found decades later, "We passed through so many towns that first night, each one brighter than all of Hamburg combined. The guards told us every town here had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He only smiled and said, 'You'll see.'" When their train stopped in Roanoke, Virginia, the prisoners watched as American railway workers refilled water and coal in just 30 minutes, a job that would have taken 2 hours back home. It was another quiet reminder that everything they had believed about American weakness was simply untrue. As the train stopped for refueling, the German prisoners watched in silence. Everything around them moved with effortless precision. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, and machines that greased the engines without a single worker lifting a hand. Every detail spoke of advanced technology and near-limitless power. What struck them even more was the casual wealth of the American workers. Men wore sturdy leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' pay. They drank Coca-Cola straight from glass bottles, tossed them aside without care, and smoked cigarette after cigarette, often throwing them away half-finished. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, once an electrical engineer at Siemens, was stunned. He estimated that this one railway yard used more electricity in an hour than his entire Berlin district used in a full day. "The waste was magnificent," he wrote later. They left lights burning in empty buildings. Fans ran in rooms where no one worked. It was carelessness born from endless supply. As the trains crossed Tennessee and Kentucky, the soldiers began to see America's industrial strength in full view. Through the windows stretched factory after factory, each one larger than anything they had ever seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee alone ran 3 miles along the river, consuming more power than the entire city of Munich. Outside Louisville, they passed the Rubber Town complex, a vast cluster of synthetic rubber factories built in only 18 months. for enormous plants, each employing thousands of workers, together produce over 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber every year. In comparison, Germany, which had invented the process, had never reached even a quarter of that amount. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, instantly recognized what he was seeing. In a post-war interview, he recalled, "I could identify the distillation towers and catalytic crackers. Each plant was more advanced than anything we had ever built, and there were 4 of them here alone. The guard said there were dozens more like it across the country." Farther north, they passed Ford's Willow Run factory outside Detroit, so massive it could be seen for miles. Built in just 9 months, the plant produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At its peak, 42,000 workers assembled aircraft using more than 1.5 million parts supplied by 1,500 subcontractors. The facility covered 2.5 million square feet and consumed more power than the entire city of Cologne. Hauptmann Verl, a Luftwaffe pilot captured in Tunisia, pressed his face to the glass as they passed the plant. He counted at least 17 bombers under construction. "We had been told American planes were weak, rushed, and poorly made," he wrote later. "But I could see the precision of their assembly lines. These were not inferior machines. They were built faster and cleaner than we thought possible. The deeper they traveled into the country, the more the myths they had grown up with began to crumble." In St. Louis, the train crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge. Below them, barges floated past, each carrying enough grain to feed thousands. Along the riverbanks, rows of grain elevators stretched for miles, each one able to supply a German city for months. Underscharfer Karl Schmidt, the son of a Bavarian farmer, recorded his disbelief. "The Americans move food the way we move ammunition, in endless quantities, without concern for loss. I saw one barge loaded with enough wheat to feed my village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich stacked thicker with meat than my weekly ration." When the train reached Kansas City, the prisoners smelled the massive stockyards before they even saw them. Thousands of cattle waited for slaughter, and the air was filled with the heavy scent of meat-packing plants. German POWs used the small rations of 200 grams of meat per week. Watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during lunch. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Corporal Paul Fisher. "No, they ate meat the way we wish we could eat bread." Then, in an almost surreal gesture, one of the guards bought them hamburgers from a nearby stand, thick patties with cheese, vegetables, and soft white bread. He handed out 20 of them and paid with a single dollar bill. The men looked at each other in disbelief. In Germany, such a meal would have been a rare luxury. Here, it was just an ordinary lunch. For the German prisoners, the food they received wasn't a luxury. It was simply normal American fare. But the real shock came when they arrived at the prison camps. Camp Herndon, Texas, built in only 4 months, held nearly 5,000 prisoners under conditions far better than most of them had known back home. The barracks had electric lights, flushing toilets, hot showers, and steam heating. Each building used more wood than some entire German villages possessed. The camp's hospital amazed the German medical officers. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, couldn't believe what he saw. The hospital had X-ray machines, surgical instruments, and medical supplies that had been nearly impossible to find in Germany since 1941. They even had penicillin, he later said, a drug the Germans had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even for minor infections. While our soldiers were dying from lack of basic medicine, the Americans treated us with their best. The camp kitchen revealed yet another level of abundance. The German cooks who worked there found walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, gas ovens, and dishwashers that cleaned thousands of plates automatically. Meals were prepared for thousands every day, with fresh milk, meat, eggs, vegetables, and soft white bread. Foods German civilians hadn't seen since the war began. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, once a hotel chef in Munich, wrote, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled, just extra. The Americans require that we cook 10% more than needed to make sure everyone gets a full meal. The rest goes to waste. I cried while throwing perfectly good bread into the trash. By September 1943, America faced a labor shortage, especially in farming. To keep up with demand, the government began using prisoners of war to work in fields and factories. What began as a practical solution turned into one of the most powerful blows to Nazi ideology imaginable. Each day, trucks carried groups of German POWs through the open American countryside. No blindfolds, no secrecy. They saw everything. Endless fields of corn and wheat, massive factories running around the clock, stores filled with goods, parking lots full of cars, homes equipped with radios and refrigerators. Outside Houston, one prisoner, Herbert Lang, watched the cotton gin process in 1 hour what his entire village couldn't have done in a month. The machine ran on electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural program that had brought power to nearly every Texas farm by 1943. The farmer who owned it wasn't rich or important, Lang wrote. He wasn't a noble or a party member, just a farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a car, a truck, and a tractor. His workers, including the black laborers, ate lunches that contained more food than a German worker would see in a week. And this was normal. Every farm we saw was the same. In Nebraska, prisoners sent to work in the sugar beet field saw agricultural machinery beyond anything they had imagined. One combine could replace 100 men's labor. The field stretched to the horizon, each larger than entire German counties. The farmers talked casually about harvests that sounded impossible. 60 bushels of wheat per acre, double Germany's best yields. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffman, working near Scottsbluff, wrote in disbelief. The farmer's son, just 16, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father ever owned. When I told him that, he laughed and said it wasn't even a good tractor. His father was waiting for a newer model from John Deere. The greatest shock, however, came to those assigned to work near American factories. They weren't allowed to work on direct war production, but even the civilian industries supporting the war showed a level of power and organization that left the German soldiers speechless. It became clear to them that what they were witnessing wasn't propaganda. It was reality. The reality of American power became impossible to ignore once German prisoners began working inside U.S. factories. Though they weren't allowed to take part in direct war production, this rule still exposed them to something more eye-opening: the full scale of America's industrial strength. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, they watched automated lines process more tomatoes in a single day than German plants could handle in an entire month. Most of the workers were women and older men, since younger men were serving in the military, yet production still surpassed pre-war levels. Sergeant Major Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a food processing plant back home, wrote, "Everything was electric and automatic, conveyor belts, filling machines, steam cookers. One elderly woman controlled what would have taken 50 workers in Germany. She did it calmly, sipping coffee and listening to the radio." Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant got a direct look at America's automotive industry, turned wartime machine. Across the river, they could see the vast Ford River Rouge complex, 100,000 people working to build jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed more electricity each day than the entire city of Hamburg. From the train, we could see parking lots filled with cars, wrote Lieutenant Franz Kellner. In Germany, even officers rarely owned one. Here, factory workers drove to work. Some had 2 cars. We thought the guard was joking, but he wasn't. By winter 1943, the psychological effect of what the prisoners had seen reached its peak. American intelligence officers described it as an ideological collapse. The U.S. Army Special Project Division, a secret program aimed at re-educating POWs, reported that more and more prisoners were asking for American newspapers, books, and language lessons. Major Paul Nolan wrote in a December 1943 report, "They no longer argue when shown production numbers. They've seen too much. The diehards are silent now. They still say they love Germany, but no longer speak of victory." The shift even appeared in camp newspapers written by prisoners themselves. Der Ruff, the Call, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, slowly turned from patriotic defiance to discussions about democracy, freedom, and rebuilding Europe after the war. Editors, mostly anti-Nazi German soldiers, found that their fellow prisoners were suddenly eager to read and debate these topics. Lieutenant Hermann Gotz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote home in a censored letter, "We were told America was weak, divided, ruled by Jews, and incapable of real strength. Every day here proves the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were lied to by criminals." The biggest blow to Nazi pride came later that year, after Italy surrendered in September 1943. Italian prisoners who agreed to cooperate were placed in Italian service units. They were given better housing, more pay, and even allowed to work freely alongside Americans. German prisoners watched, stunned, as their former allies ate in U.S. restaurants, earned money, sent letters home, and were even seen dating American women. Sergeant Friedrich Schultz wrote bitterly, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we ever treated them as allies. They work freely, earn wages, send gifts home. The Americans show them no hatred. The democracy we were taught to despise is more honorable than our own system." Then came Christmas 1943, the event that broke the last pieces of Nazi belief among many prisoners. Churches, schools, and civic groups across America sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German POWs, men who had been fighting against them only months earlier. Each parcel contained cigarettes, candy, soap, and games. Communities even invited prisoners to local Christmas dinners. At Camp Hearn, the town's Methodist choir performed carols in German, women baked cookies and cakes, and the Boy Scouts delivered handmade holiday cards. This unexpected kindness shook the Germans deeply. Lieutenant Walter Muller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many of them have sons fighting against us, yet they show mercy and kindness, not propaganda, but genuine humanity. Only a people absolutely confident in their strength could act this way." The Christmas feast itself felt unreal. Turkey, ham, potatoes, vegetables, pies, and ice cream. Food in amounts not seen in Germany since before World War I. The prisoners ate until they couldn't move, overwhelmed not just by the meal, but by what it represented. "We ate like kings," wrote Sergeant Hans Sass. "Better than our generals, better than the party leaders." That night, we finally understood what real power looks like, not hatred or fear, but generosity. And this was not a special occasion. The guards explained that this was an ordinary American Christmas meal, the same dinner being served in homes across the country. "If this is what they feed prisoners," one soldier whispered, "what must their own soldiers be eating?" By early 1944, more than 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and science. The University of Chicago offered correspondence courses, while professors from Stanford University traveled to teach in person, lecturing on democracy, economics, and philosophy. The hunger for knowledge was overwhelming. Many of these men had been told that Americans were crude and uneducated. Instead, they discovered public libraries filled with millions of books, universities open to all classes, and scientific institutions leading the world. They could even read American newspapers freely, comparing different political opinions, something impossible in Germany. One physicist, Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, who had been drafted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended physics lectures at Camp Shelby. The American professors, some of them Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hate, he wrote later. They saw science as something belonging to all humankind. They were years ahead of our research, and they shared knowledge even with enemies. To minds shaped by Nazi ideology, this was beyond understanding. The camp theaters also became windows into a different world. Instead of propaganda, they showed regular Hollywood films. The prisoners watched Gone with the Wind and saw a story of defeat, survival, and rebuilding that strangely mirrored their own situation. They saw The Grapes of Wrath and were stunned that Americans would show such honest criticism of their own society. "They hide nothing," wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. "They show their failures, their conflicts, even their flaws. But this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such truth would mean death. Here it's called patriotism." By spring 1944, as American wartime production reached its height, prisoner labor expanded across the country. German POWs worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing firsthand the scale of U.S. industry. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, they unloaded steel that would soon become landing craft for the invasion of Europe. The factory produced around 700 boats each month, each made from 20,000 separate parts. Over 20,000 people worked there, including women welding metal, black workers running cranes, and teenagers operating drills. Sergeant Kurt Zimmerman wrote in disbelief, "Women doing men's work, black workers handling complex machinery, teenagers managing production lines. Everything we were told could never happen in a democracy, yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They made more boats in a single month than our Navy built in a year." At Republic Steel in Ohio, other prisoners saw blast furnaces roaring day and night, turning out 10,000 tons of steel every day. Endless trains brought iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The sight defied everything they thought they knew about production. Oberreiter Paul Hartmann, who had worked at Krupp before the war, admitted, "I thought I understood industrial manufacturing, but this was beyond imagination. They wasted more steel through spillage than we could produce in total." Their workers complained about overtime while producing what we couldn't achieve with forced labor and double shifts. The summer harvest of 1944 delivered the final blow to Nazi propaganda about American weakness. Across the Midwest, German POWs saw farms that looked more like industrial empires. In Kansas, they watched wheat harvest where single farms produced more grain than entire provinces in Germany. Massive combined harvesters swept through golden fields like ships crossing an ocean, each one capable of harvesting 100 acres a day. It was then that many finally accepted a truth they had resisted for months. The world they had been taught to believe in was gone, and America's strength, built on freedom, equality, and opportunity, was far greater than any system based on fear or control. The grain elevators of prisoners helped Phil could store more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote, "One American farmer, with his machines, does the work of 100 Germans." They showed us aerial photos, endless wheat fields stretching for thousands of miles. Even if they lost half their harvest, they would still have more than all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that seemed to have no end. They watched in disbelief as perfectly good fruit was thrown away for being slightly bruised or misshapen. Food that would have been precious in war-torn Germany. Sometimes entire crops were plowed under just to stabilize prices. For men who came from a country suffering hunger and rationing, this was nearly impossible to comprehend. They destroyed food to keep prices steady, wrote Corporal Otto Schultz. "I saw piles of oranges pushed into pits by bulldozers. We begged them to send the fruit to our families in Germany. The guards were kind, but said it couldn't be done. The waste itself was proof of their endless resources." Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, the last fragments of Nazi belief collapsed. The numbers alone were staggering. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 soldiers landing in the first wave. The sheer organization of it went far beyond anything Germany had ever been capable of. Within days, the prisoners at Camp Shelby were shown newsreels of the invasion. They saw a sea of Allied ships stretching to the horizon, the floating harbors, and the supply lines delivering thousands of tons of equipment every day across open beaches. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that the war and the entire Nazi project was lost. Friedrich von Tauben later wrote, "We knew then it was over, not just the fighting, but the idea itself. We had tried to defeat the greatest industrial power on earth with fairy tales and arrogance. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their machine guns, pride against their endless supply lines. But even more than the technology or the food, what broke the Nazi worldview was American humanity. Despite everything they had been told, that Americans were weak, sentimental, or ruthless, the prisoners found compassion. When Sergeant Hans Muller received word that his son had died in the Hamburg bombings, the American camp commander personally delivered a message and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote from Germany that she and their children were starving, American church groups quietly organized care packages and sent them to the Red Cross. They made a clear difference between Germans and Nazis, wrote Captain Otto Heidmann. They said they were fighting Hitler, not the German people. At first, I thought this was propaganda, but it was real. They were already preparing us to rebuild Germany, not destroy it. The medical care shocked them most. German doctors were invited to work side by side with American medical teams, learning new methods and using advanced equipment. Prisoners underwent surgeries that would have been reserved for the wealthy back home. Those suffering from trauma or mental illness were treated with therapy, something almost unknown in the German army. Dr. Friedrich Bauer recorded, "They treated suicide attempts with counseling, not punishment. Soldiers who broke down were given rest and therapy, not beaten. Their compassion for their enemies revealed a kind of strength we never understood, the calm confidence of true power." By March 1945, the U.S. reeducation program had achieved results few thought possible. More than 25,000 German prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. Camp newspapers printed articles about constitutional rights, free markets, and equality under the law. Discussion circles debated how Germany could rebuild after the war. Men who had once shouted Nazi slogans were now writing essays about democratic reform. Officers who had sworn loyalty to Hitler were sketching out ways to modernize German farming with American methods. For many of them, the transformation was complete. They no longer believed in conquest or racial destiny, but in rebuilding a nation grounded in freedom, reason, and human dignity. "We became missionaries for democracy," recalled August Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reichsmarshal, in a 1975 interview. "Not because anyone forced us, but because we saw it with our own eyes. We saw ordinary people living better than our own aristocrats. We wanted that life for Germany." The change among German prisoners was so profound that even American officials began to worry some were becoming too enthusiastic about the American way of life. A number of them asked to stay in the United States after the war. Others fell in love through correspondence programs and eventually married American women. By the 1950s, thousands would immigrate permanently. In April 1945 came the final, most devastating revelation. As U.S. troops liberated the concentration camps, film footage and photographs were shown to the German POWs. At first, many refused to believe what they saw, calling it propaganda. But soon letters from home confirmed the truth. Testimonies from soldiers and survivors left no room for denial. The emotional impact was overwhelming. Men who had lost the war with some lingering sense of pride now realized they had also lost their honor. Everything they had fought for was not just defeated. It was morally rotten. Captain Walter Schmidt expressed it best. "We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to others, but we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what true civilization means." When the war ended in May 1945, the prisoners faced repatriation with conflicted emotions. They were going home to a shattered nation, yet they had experience in America that overturned everything they'd been taught to believe. They had eaten better as captives than as soldiers. They had been treated with more dignity by their enemies than by their own leaders. In their final months, American officials prepared them for return. Prisoners were given vocational training, agricultural lessons, and political education. They learned about the Marshall Plan even before it was officially announced. The message was clear. America would help rebuild Germany, not destroy it. Lieutenant Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "They gave us skills, knowledge, and hope. They turned defeated soldiers into future citizens. Their generosity was something a Nazi mind could never understand." Between 1945 and 1946, more than 370,000 German POWs were sent home from American camps. They returned to a nation in ruins, divided, impoverished, and humbled, but they carried something powerful with them: first-hand knowledge of how a free, democratic society functioned. These former prisoners became the quiet architects of post-war Germany's transformation. They had seen efficiency without oppression, industry without cruelty, and wealth born from fairness instead of conquest. Many went on to shape the new republic. Asterisk Hans Kroll, once held at Camp Shelby, became West Germany's ambassador to the United States. Asterisk Walter Hallstein, who had taught classes inside a POW camp, became the first president of the European Commission. Asterisk Rudiger von Marx, a former prisoner at Camp Herne, later served as Germany's representative to the United Nations. Asterisk Eduard Ackermann, imprisoned at Fort Robinson, led major agricultural reforms back home. They brought with them American-style efficiency to German factories, modern farming techniques to its fields, and democratic ideals to its politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s, West Germany's astonishing recovery, was built in part on lessons learned behind barbed wire in the American heartland. Hans Kroll summed it up simply in his memoirs. We learned that prosperity comes from freedom, not conquest. Democracy creates wealth. Diversity gives strength. When workers are treated well, production thrives. Historians now regard the German POW experience in the United States as one of the most successful reeducation efforts in modern history. It didn't rely on force, fear, or propaganda, only on truth exposure and the undeniable power of example. Observation, not ideology, turned prisoners of war into believers in democracy. The German prisoners had seen something that no lecture or leaflet could have taught them. They watched a free society run at full strength, efficient, confident, and humane, even towards enemies. They witnessed factories producing on a scale that made German industry seem outdated, and they lived with standard comfort that turned every Nazi promise into a clear lie. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the foremost historian of the German POW experience in America, later summed it up perfectly. America won the propaganda war not through speeches, but through reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The prisoners were converted by prosperity. The numbers proved his point. Out of 371,683 German POWs held in the United States, fewer than 1% ever tried to escape. Only 2,222 escape attempts were recorded in total. After the war, 95% of former prisoners rated their treatment as good or excellent. Thousands stayed in touch with American families for decades. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, over 500 former prisoners returned to the United States for a reunion in Austin, Texas, many bringing their children and grandchildren to show them where their lives had changed. Dr. Hans Vea, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later became a physician in Maine, told the audience, "Life in the camps was better than anything many of us had known growing up. We had running water, heating, and more food than we ever imagined. But what mattered most was dignity." Another former prisoner, Sergeant Kurtmeyer, who had worked on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us like young men far from home, not like enemies. They shared their food, their tools, sometimes even their homes. That kindness, shown to men whose armies were fighting their sons, changed us forever." At the reunion dinner, August Hermann Gotz, now 78 years old, delivered the closing speech that captured everything they had come to believe. "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in lies. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America taught us that strength comes not from conquest, but from creation, not from hatred, but from tolerance, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We saw farmers feeding the world, workers building victory, and citizens showing compassion to their foes. The real weapon of America was not its tanks or its bombs, but its endless ability to create and its confidence in doing what was right. We returned to Germany determined to build a country that could create instead of destroy, that could prosper in peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ruins was built on lessons we learned here. We came as conquerors and left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends, thank you for showing us the way." When he finished, the auditorium erupted in applause. Americans and Germans, once bitter foes, stood together, united by the recognition of a transformation that seemed unthinkable back in June 1943, when the first prisoner trains arrived in Texas. The scope of the German POW experience in the United States was staggering. Asterisk Camp Network Asterisk, over 500 camps spread across 45 states, every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. Asterisk camp size asterisk 175 main camps supported by 325 smaller branch camps, each housing between 250 and 12,000 prisoners. Most were built in just 90 days. Asterisk population asterisk 371,683 German prisoners out a total of 425,871 Axis POWs, with the largest population in May 1945. Asterisk arrivals asterisk an average of 20,000 new prisoners per month in 1943, increasing to 30,000 after D-Day and 60,000 during the final months of the war. Asterisk labor contribution asterisk 14 million man-days of agricultural labor, 100 million board feet of lumber processed, and $230 million worth of wartime labor value, earning each prisoner about 80 cents a day. Asterisk escape rate asterisk only 2,222 escape attempts out of more than 371,000 prisoners, an astonishingly low rate of 0.6%. These men arrived as soldiers of defeated empire and left as witnesses to a different kind of power, one built not on fear or conquest, but on opportunity, decency, and respect. For many, their time in America did not end in captivity. It began their education in freedom. No prisoner ever made a permanent escape from an American camp. Of the few who tried, nearly all were recaptured within a day, and not a single American civilian was ever harmed. The education system inside the camps was equally impressive. More than 40,000 German prisoners took part in classes. Over 135 camp newspapers were published. 30,000 studied English. 15,000 received vocational training, and 8,000 completed university-level correspondence courses through institutions such as the University of Chicago and Stanford. After the war, around 5,000 former prisoners immigrated to the United States, while over 12,000 continued writing letters to American families they had befriended during captivity, many of those friendships lasting an average of 30 years. Countless others later returned to America as tourists or business partners. Surveys taken after the war told the same story. 95% of German prisoners rated their treatment as good or excellent. Nearly three-quarters said their time in America had changed the way they saw the world. Over 60% expressed interest in learning more about democracy. By 1945, fewer than 10% still held strong Nazi beliefs. These men hadn't just witnessed history. They had been transformed by it. Their captivity became an education. Their defeat turned into understanding. Their imprisonment became liberation from an ideology that had enslaved their minds. In the end, America's greatest victory didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened inside its prison camps, where evidence of freedom and abundance achieved what no army could: the complete collapse of Nazi ideology. The German soldiers who arrived in 1943 believed they came from a superior nation and that America was soft and divided. They left knowing the truth. They had seen a free society's power, a society that could outproduce, outthink, and outlast tyranny because it treated its people with dignity. The trains that carried warriors of the Third Reich into captivity returned home 3 years later with men who had helped build democracy. They had seen the future, and it worked. Their story stands as proof of a profound truth. America's most powerful weapon was not its bombs or its tanks, but its ability to show what freedom could create. Every factory, every farm, every school, every meal became living proof that prosperity is born from liberty, not domination. The German POWs had come expecting to find weakness. Instead, they found strength wrapped in compassion, power guided by principle, and progress rooted in equality. They returned to Germany not as defeated soldiers, but as witnesses to a better way of life. The West German economic miracle of the 1950s was built in part on what they learned behind those fences. That success comes not from conquest, but from cooperation. Not from racial superiority, but from shared dignity. Not from fear, but from freedom. What began in June 1943, when 1,850 veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped off a train in Mexia, Texas, became one of history's most remarkable transformations. The story of the German prisoners in America is, above all, a story of redemption through understanding, a victory not destruction but of demonstration. It shows that true strength lies not in how much a nation can destroy, but in how much it can build. Those men, once soldiers of a brutal regime, became carriers of a new idea, witnesses to democracy who would help rebuild their country on the principles they had seen work. Their journey from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens remains one of the most extraordinary human transformations of the 20th century, accomplished not through violence, but through the undeniable proof of what a free people can achieve when united by purpose, progress, and humanity. In the end, that was America's secret weapon. Not just its power to win wars, but its power to turn enemies into allies, through the simple, unstoppable force of example. When the first train of weary German soldiers rolled into Mexia, Texas, on that warm June evening in 1943, no one could have imagined that history's greatest transformation was quietly beginning. These men arrived as prisoners of war, soldiers of a regime built on hate and supremacy, convinced they came from a nation of order and power and that America was weak, soft, and divided. Within 3 years, they would return home as witnesses to the exact opposite, believers in a system they had been taught to despise. What happened inside those barbed wire fences remains one of the most remarkable stories of moral and cultural transformation in modern history. There were no indoctrination speeches, no forced propaganda films, no re-education camps in the traditional sense. The weapon that reshaped their worldview wasn't violence, but exposure, the simple, undeniable proof of what a free and democratic nation could create. Every experience contradicted what they had been told in Germany. They saw ordinary citizens living lives of abundance and equality, where electricity flowed to every farmhouse, where workers drove their own cars, and where even prisoners were fed meals that seemed luxurious by wartime standards. They stepped into barracks with electric lights, hot showers, and running water, and realized that this decadent enemy provided its captives with comforts their own government couldn't offer its citizens. For men raised on stories of Aryan superiority, the reality was shattering. They saw women running cranes, black workers operating complex machinery, and teenagers managing factory lines with confidence and skill. They witnessed a nation that not only tolerated diversity, but turned it into strength. In the factories, fields, and shipyards of America, the ideology of Nazism unraveled not through argument, but through sight. By 1944, what began as disbelief had turned into curiosity, and then admiration. Thousands of prisoners signed up for classes in English, history, economics, and science. They attended lectures by university professors who treated them as students, not enemies. Many were stunned when Jewish scholars, men who had fled Hitler's Germany, taught them without anger or revenge. In those moments, the prisoners confronted a truth far more powerful than any propaganda. Decency, freedom, and knowledge were stronger than hate. The turning point wasn't one event, but 1,000 small revelations. The farmer who shared his lunch with German laborers working his field. The American officer who personally delivered condolences to a prisoner whose son had died in the Hamburg bombings. The choir from a small-town church singing Christmas carols in German for men who, months earlier, had been their nation's sworn enemies. Each act of kindness chipped away at a worldview built on fear and division. And as they watched films, read newspapers, and spoke with Americans, they discovered something else: honesty. American society did not hide its flaws. Its newspapers debated politics openly. Its movies portrayed failure and redemption without censorship. In Germany, such openness would have meant imprisonment or death. In America, it was celebrated as strength. The prisoners began to see that democracy's power lay not in perfection, but in its freedom to question itself and improve. By the time Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, the transformation was nearly complete. The German POWs watched newsreels of the invasion in stunned silence. The scale of the operation, thousands of ships, planes, and men moving with impossible coordination, revealed the full might of America's industrial power. For many, it was a moment of final surrender, not just militarily, but ideologically. They understood then that their nation had lost more than a war. It had lost its soul. What came after was not humiliation, but renewal. American officers began preparing the prisoners for their eventual return home, teaching them democracy, vocational skills, and even details of the coming Marshall Plan. They were told that Germany would be rebuilt, not destroyed, that enemies would become partners, that justice did not require hatred. For men raised on revenge and dominance, This was the most radical lesson of all. When they finally returned to Germany between 1945 and 1946, they stepped off ships not as conquerors or captives, but as converts to a new understanding of power. They carried with them memories of farms that produced plenty, factories that ran without cruelty, and communities that thrived on fairness and cooperation. They had seen how freedom worked, and they wanted to bring it home. In the years that followed, many of those former prisoners became teachers, engineers, and politicians in the new West Germany. They helped rebuild their nation using the lessons learned in captivity, that efficiency thrives under quality, that prosperity grows from liberty, and that true strength lies in compassion. Some rose to high office. Others quietly improved their towns and industries. But together, they became the living bridge between two worlds once divided by war. Historians now call it one of the most successful re-education efforts in history, a transformation achieved not through control, but through example. America's greatest victory wasn't measured in territory gained or enemies killed, but in minds changed. The men who had arrived chanting Heil Hitler left believing in free elections and civic responsibility. Their defeat became their enlightenment. For decades later, when hundreds of these men returned to the United States for a reunion, they spoke not as former captives, but as friends. "We came as enemies," one said, "and left as students." That statement, simple and sincere, summarized the quiet miracle of those years. In the end, the most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was not its tanks, planes, or bombs. It was a moral and material proof of what a free society could achieve. It wasn't force that reshaped these men, but faith. Faith demonstrated daily in the ordinary abundance of life in a democracy. The legacy of that transformation endures today. The modern alliance between Germany and the United States, once unthinkable, was born in those camps. The prosperity of post-war Europe, the stability of NATO, and the moral framework of Western democracy were all, in some small way, shaped by men who once wore the uniforms of their enemies.